Greetings, friends. Juan Ingrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the week of April 15th through the 21st of 2024. And this week we have a ton of updates. A lot of interesting updates on the Donetsk front. And this week is the Russians have made small breakthroughs in a lot of areas on the Donetsk front, and we're going to talk about it this week. First, we're going to talk about kind of the main nexus of where the Russians have been mostly concentrated on since they started their winter push in Avdiivka. Let's talk about one of the key nodes of the Ukrainian defenses, and that is Ocheretyne. Now, if you told me last week that the Russians would be battling for this town this week, I would have called you crazy. I would be like, no, they're going to, it'll take them a few months to reach Ocheretyne. But I was wrong. The Russians, I have no clue how. I don't know how the Ukrainians managed to have the Russians penetrate so deeply into here, but the Russians have penetrated into Ocheretyne. So let's talk about what happened. So the Russians seem to have activated in the north of Avdiivka, which is very surprising. I did not expect this at all. I was expecting them to continue their offensive to the west. However, the offensive to the west has actually kind of stopped in terms of this area, kind of towards Umanska, Yasnobronovka, and Natalova. They advanced right up to these villages and then kind of stopped. They kind of took the fields between Toninka and these villages, but then kind of stopped. And there's been really no major movements in this area. There's been some confirmations that the Russians are now trying to battle in Natalova, entering the first houses. But obviously, going straight through it is going to be very hard. In order to take Natalova, they'll have to take Yasnobronovka and take this upper fields in the north here. So, so they've entered Natalova, but, very small gains. But, so this is where I thought they would push. I thought they would try to continue pushing towards the Vochachka River and the reservoir. However, they didn't do that. They actually activated to the north. And I thought, there's no really need to because, the Russians had this rail line. They had a good, secure flank on the north. However, they have pushed the north, and I think this is paying dividends, and I think I know why. So one of the main axes of the Russians have been trying to secure the first line of Ukrainian defense after the fall of Avdiivka in Berdychi, Semyonovka, Orlovka, and such. And while they've taken Toninka and Orlovka, Berdychi and Semyonovka have been very stubborn to fall because the Ukrainians keep sending troops from this second line of Ukrainian defense towards Berdychi. And since there's a small little river here, the Russians have a hard time crossing that river and holding their ground here as the Ukrainians keep attacking. And so I think what the Russians did is that they decided to unlock the north, because here's what's happening. So the Ukrainians have on the very western outskirts of Berdychi, they have positions. However, if let's say the Ukrainians are starting to get flanked all the way back to the rear, all the way in Ocheretyne, in Novomykhailivka, and Selinova, then the Ukrainians can no longer just send troops from here and down here. They're basically getting cut off. They're being strangled, and so the Ukrainians can no longer continuously support their operations in Berdychi and Selinova. And I think that was the reason why the Russians did this daring push to break through towards Ocheretyne, which worked. Let's talk about what happened. So what happened was the Russians, I have no clue how, they managed to take the Ocheretyne dachas, this area right here. This was the nexus of Ukrainian defense. The capturing of these Ocheretyne dachas right here, where the railway splits, connected the northern Avdiivka defense with the western Avdiivka defense for the Ukrainians. And the capture of these Ocheretyne dachas somehow basically cut the defense of this in two almost. And the Russians didn't stop. The Russians have expanded their offensive and actually managed to enter the Ocheretyne southern dachas. Now, right now, it looks like the nexus of the fighting is going on in the railway. They are reaching the railways right here, the railway stations right here, and this they're using this rail line as a natural defense. The Ukrainians obviously have positions in the railway, but they also have to kind of in the more southern or northern parts of Ocheretyne. They have these high-rise buildings here. They have positions on the other side, but the Russians are trying to make like a bit of a foothold in Ocheretyne, and they're doing that by using this railroad. Kind of the same thing in Krasnohorivka, but they're basically going to be advanced. And the rumor is that right now they're advancing along this residential area to the south, and then there's going to be a clash for the train station. And they're hoping to basically solidify themselves here and then kind of use this as a foothold as the Russians continue their envelopment of Ocheretyne. And so that's big, because let's go up a little bit. Let's say Ocheretyne, the southern part, falls. And not only that, the Russians have also expanded more to the west. They are now right on the outskirts of Novomykhailivka. And they've also, the geolocated footage shows the Russians are advancing along this tree line. They probably are now in the south of Novomykhailivka. So not only are they in the north of Novomykhailivka, right in front of it, and to the south of it, and that means the Russians could advance from the south directly on it, and then to the south here as well. And I have no doubts that this is where the Russians will attack next, and they will capture Novomykhailivka, if only because they need to capture this village in order to continuously secure their gains in Ocheretyne. And I have no doubt then also after that they will also continue their advance and try to advance on Selinova. And so I think the Russian axis of attack seems to be something like this. They're going to try to advance there, take these two small villages, and then push the Ukrainians away from Ocheretyne so that they can continue their capture over Ocheretyne. The capture over Ocheretyne not only completely collapses the Ukrainian defense in the north, it's one of the big linchpins of Ukrainian defense in the north of Avdiivka, but it also gives the Russians operational space. This gives them another expansion point where they could break through and towards this is going to be a very important point. The Russians are going to expand, not only north here, because look, there's only a bunch of random little villages that if they don't, the Ukrainians could try to build defenses here, but they didn't expect the Russians to break through so fast. So if the Russians continue their push, taking these villages might be easier than would be expected. They're going to go north, but I think one of the biggest pieces of the pie for a future Russian operation after the capture of Ocheretyne is this highway. You might be wondering, why is this highway so important? Why do they want to advance and cut this highway? Well, because it cuts off two of the main Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. Taking this highway cuts off Ukrainian positions in Pokrovsk, which is kind of the last line of Donbass defense that the Ukrainians are building around Pokrovsk, and then kind of the main Ukrainian defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Torres. Now, they don't cut off all the supplies, obviously, but this connects Konstantinovka with Pokrovsk. And so basically, severing this from Ocheretyne and severing this highway would be very detrimental to the flow of logistics and such. So this is very, the breakthrough towards Ocheretyne was very unexpected. So, and not only that, if they do manage to take Novomykhailivka and start advancing towards Selinova, I have no doubts that the Ukrainians will give up Berezhny and Sininovka and then basically advance towards retreat back to Novopokrovsk, Novosilica, Pershi, these villages here, and also back to the Vochachka River. And so, and because of that, we have now basically got confirmation that some sources are saying the Russians have captured all of Sininovka. I'm of the opinion that until the Ukrainians fully pull back from Berezhny, which they have not just yet, but I have no doubt that if the Russians continue to develop their offensive here, if it doesn't stall, then the Ukrainians will give up Berezhny and by extension Sininovka. About 3/4 of Sininovka is under Russian control this week. We got some pro-Russian sources; they have captured all of it. Most neutral and Ukrainian sources say that they have only captured about 3/4 of it. Mostly, almost everyone has confirmed that they have captured the center of the village. The reason why it's kind of hard to take the northern part is because it's basically connected to Berezhny, where the Ukrainians are making their big stand, and basically, since they have positions in this area of Berezhny, they also have positions to continue supporting Ukrainians here in the northern part of Sininovka. And so it's kind of like, the two villages are kind of connected, so they're able to support operations there. And it doesn't help that the Ukrainians also have positions in these fields where they continue attacking the Russians directly. So, if the operation continues to expand in the north, I have no doubt that Berezhny and Sininovka will fall and the Ukrainians will fall back. Along with this, the Russians are making breakthroughs towards Novomykhailivka. There's been a huge increase in bombing activity of Novomykhailivka and Keramik. The Russians are geolocated in these two streets right here. Pro-Russian sources say basically the extent of the defense is like right here. And so this area is under Russian control. And basically and not only that, most sources also say the Russians are expanding out of this dacha, which was like kind of the nexus of this area, and captured another tree line here. I'm pretty certain that the next Russian attack will probably try to sever this road that connects Ocheretyne and Novomykhailivka and try to advance like right here. Try to cut it in half, cut the things off here, and then kind of envelop Novomykhailivka from two sides, from here, and then take Novomykhailivka. Because then once Novomykhailivka falls, then the Russians, let's say will be able to attack Ocheretyne from the east here, not just from the south. And so they that's more pressure on Ocheretyne. Or if they want to, they could, if they take Karamek and Novomykhailivka, they could attack towards Arkhangelsk here and just completely collapse Ocheretyne. But that might be a bit of a tall order for the Russians, because that we say this in paper, but there's probably a lot of defenses that the Ukrainians have put up here. So that's what's happening in Avdiivka. A lot of big, changes, on the north of Avdiivka, and I kind of explain kind of the purposes of this. How what's going on, why this is happening. I actually don't know how they managed to break through, but they are, and kind of the purposes of that. So let's see how the Russians develop their offensive to the north of Avdiivka. One thing also that's interesting is, as we talk about the Donetsk front here, is this area right here. So after the capture of Peremyska and Novolsky, the Ukrainians who were in this kind of open fields right here were created in a bit of a pocket. And so the Russian, now thing is, this has been the front line for like a year and a half now. So the Ukrainians have a massive trench system, massive mine system here. This is very heavily mined, and this is open fields. And I've always said this in my videos, but the open fields is the most dangerous place you could be in this war, because drones, bombs, you are basically out in the open to die. And so any attack here would be, any clearing of this section would be very bloody for the Russians. But the Russians, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are slowly but surely trying to clear out this pocket so they can connect Novolsky and Peremyska, have this be a coherent defense line as the Russians continue pushing to the west of Avdiivka. So some sources say they have reached kind of this ravine right here. They've taken some fields to the south of Peremyska, and they're basically trying to cut this off and then just kind of slowly clear this area and make this into a competent defense line for the Russians. However, this is heavily mined. This is heavily, a lot of sources are saying there's no Ukrainians here per se, that the Ukrainians gave up and retreated to the fields back here. But again, it's going to take a while for the Russians to clear this and comb this area. But yeah, the Russians are starting the operations after the capture of Peremyska to try to, make this a coherent defense line. Because right now, these two areas are kind of split up. The Russians here in Novolsky are kind of separated from Peremyska, and so they need to make this a competent defense line as they continue pushing towards Talova and towards the Vochachka River. Let's talk about now another area of where the Russians made a breakthrough and where the Russians are also pushing, the South Donetsk front from Krasnohorivka to Ugledar. And let's talk about Novomykhailivka. Let's talk about this area. This week, the Russians have, basically by the end of this week, the Russians have confirmed they have captured 100% of Novomykhailivka. Some sources say that, the most western outskirts are being combed, it's not fully controlled yet, but we have, the Russians are, the Marine brigades of the Russians are raising their flags here, saying they have captured the village. This village, or town, has taken a long time to capture. The Ukrainians really fought hard for this. The reason being is because with the capture of Novomykhailivka, they have a spring point towards Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka, if this falls, is actually... So right now, the fall of Novomykhailivka helps Russians strategically, but it doesn't necessarily danger the Ukrainians strategically. The fall of Konstantinivka, however, which the fall of Novomykhailivka puts more in danger, does threaten Ukrainian defense, because if Konstantinivka falls, it kind of threatens the whole defense structure of Ugledar. The whole reason why Ugledar survived the first Russian offensive is because when the Russians attacked directly, the Ukrainians were able to use this line to attack the Russians from the east. They used the mines here as kind of like a staging ground to attack the Russians who are out on this. Out on these dachas and all that. And so, if Konstantinivka is under attack, the Ukrainians will not be able to redeploy forces to counter a hypothetical Russian assault on Ugledar, which I think is in the works. So Novomykhailivka is completely, I think it's mostly fallen anyway. Right now the Russians are consolidating themselves in these areas. And I think the next spring of Russian attack is going to be on Pereskolivka here. This is going to probably fall pretty. It's going to be easier than Novomykhailivka, I'll tell you that much. But the Russians are, again, these fields look kind of deceiving because, I think, oh, these are just fields, just advance and all that. Except there's probably a massive trench complex here. There's probably a Ukrainian fortification here. There's probably a Ukrainian trench line here. There's a trench here. So there's lots of fortification. They have to take it one at a time. So this is, these fields look, this is, I think the Russians will concentrate in the north. But again, you could also kind of see it, and again, all these fields, every single tree line you see here is trenched up to hell. This is a heavily fortified area. So the Russians are pushing very hard, and they've captured Novomykhailivka finally after a giant, massive battle that took place for months. And now we see, so that's good for the Russians. Maybe they might take a break, but I think the whole purpose of taking Novomykhailivka was taking a springboard towards Konstantinivka. Once Konstantinivka falls, I think the Russians will take a break in this sector. However, in terms of where I think the Russians will go since they captured Novomykhailivka, I think they'll focus on Pereskolivka here and try to kind of link up Pobeba with Novomykhailivka. And the whole purpose is to basically kind of take Konstantinivka, not take Konstantinivka, but kind of start squeezing it, because they can't, attacking directly is very hard for them. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to attack just directly. They want to basically have positions in the south. That's how they took Novomykhailivka. Novomykhailivka stood firm with the Ukrainians very hard until the Russians took the northern part of Novomykhailivka. And so that's when they started losing a lot of the town. And so not only that, the Russians will also try to probably push through these fields. But again, though, these fields are also trenched up to hell, and the Ukrainians are going to give the Russians a bloody nose as they try to advance towards this road. But, the Russians are going to push to the south. They're going to push here, try to take this village and try to cut off Konstantinivka from the north. And then, obviously, they're going to try to attack directly. Try to do a pincer to try to pinch out the Ukrainians from here. That's where the Russians are going to go, so we'll see how that works since they did their first job of taking Novomykhailivka. But the battle for this area has not stopped. It's not like, wow, they took Novomykhailivka, and now they're going to go all the way to Kharkiv. No, it's this is a first step. Along with this, let's kind of go more north here. In terms of this area, the Russians have expanded north between Marinka and Pobeba. The Pobeba was kind of in a little bit of a salient. And the Russians basically they have a bit of a salient towards Grigorivka, and so the Russians are trying to make this a coherent front line. They're trying to basically secure Russian positions that are on the more eastern outskirts of Grigorivka, and then have that be and then also kind of connect that with Pobeba, and kind of have that have this kind of be a coherent kind of defense line a little bit. So the Ukrainians are trying to push the Ukrainians away from Pobeba, but the Russians are basically trying to solidify a bit of a front line that prevents the Ukrainians from taking Pobeba, or continuously harassing Russian forward positions in this village. So the Russians are expanding between Grigorivka and Pobeba, basically managed to take kind of this area right here. And we'll see how the Russians continue developing their offensive from there. Let's talk about now one of the other interesting parts is another breakthrough of the Russians. Now, it looked, if you told me a week ago that, about if the Russians were going to be battling for the center industrial part of Krasnohorivka, I would have called you crazy. But again, I was surprised that the Russians are now battling for the center industrial zone of Krasnohorivka. So, what happened? So, the Russians tried to do a direct attack towards these southern dachas, and, that kind of succeeded for a little bit, but then they had to fall back. And I'm like, okay, they failed to take Krasnohorivka. But there was this massive attack, and the Russians somehow, I think maybe we talked about this last week, but I forgot. But they basically they advanced from the more eastern part instead of the south, and landed on these dachas. and they basically managed to capture this area right here. And I'm like, wow, holy crap! They took this area, the cemetery, this kind of like small residential area, and I'm like, what's gonna happen now? And what happened was somehow the Russians also reactivated in the south this week, and by the end of this week, basically the Russians have confirmed that they've captured almost all the southern residential area below the tree line, and not only that, they are now put the kind of this I think they call this the car, like a repair plant. This was like a former industrial zone right here. This is in the gray zone. The reason why people say that is because a Russian, a World War I Russian-looking tank, this giant steampunk-looking tank, was geolocated, basically moving through this area very easily, and they kind of stopped right in front of like this main Ukrainian industrial heart, and then they moved back. And there was no attacks towards it. It was like, it was able to move through this unmolested. And so, this was very interesting for the, so basically this proves that the Ukrainians no longer have a coherent position on the north of the rail lines. And so I kind of expect that, so this area is now in the gray zone, or maybe even under Russian control, who knows. And so where the Ukrainians are, however, is, they have a lot of things going for them still for Krasnohorivka. They have these high-rise buildings protecting them from the east. They have this kind of business sector and the industrial heart in the center of the town that prevents the complete, that holds the kind of the nexus of the support. And they also have a ton of a ton of residential areas to the north that are, could be easy to take, but they're not. They're in the back, so they'll be the last things the Russians could take from Krasnohorivka. What's important here is that the Russians have another, just like in Ocheretyne, they now have another another position to hold, unless the Ukrainians somehow push them back. And what the Russians will continue doing is kind of expanding their presence to the south. But this, holding this position, they're going to try to clear this area right here. They're going to try to, and then from here, they're going to try to clear the residential area here. And so the Russians will be kind of like right here. This is where the Russians want to have a secure baseline. However, the Ukrainians will have a very strong defensive position. They have positions in this industrial heart. This is a factory, and this is where the Ukrainians are holding their line. And this is a very strong line. They have good business districts in the back of it for support. They have on their flanks the high-rise buildings. This is a very heavily fortified area. And so I don't think the Russians, just because they broke through into Krasnohorivka and managed to hold about, we could say about 15% of the village or of the town, just because they captured 50% of the town doesn't mean now the town's going to collapse. The Ukrainians still have a position here to hold the line. So this town isn't going to fall quickly. But the Russians need to capture this town in order to complete the pushback of the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, because right now the Ukrainians are using Krasnohorivka as kind of the place where they could shell Donetsk, and so they need to capture this town. And I think this is where Peremysk and Novolsky comes in. They want to secure this line here better so that they could continue their advancements and try to start squeezing Krasnohorivka from the north, because it's going to be very hard for the Russians to attack the factory directly. But again, because of a daring breakthrough attack, the Russians managed to enter kind of the southern part of Krasnohorivka, take these, trying to secure themselves on these southern residential areas. They managed to, on the north of this rail line, managed to push the Ukrainians away from this kind of former industrial heart here, this repair plant here, and in the cemetery. So again, very solid progress. The Russians now have positions in Krasnohorivka. However, and they're right now trying to solidify it, but we'll see how that, once they solidify, we'll see how, if the Russians could expand beyond that. So that's the Donetsk front. Let's go where the Russians are also on the attack, and the Bakhmut front here. Let's talk about Bakhmut. Now, this week, the Chasiv Yar front has actually been not as active as the Donetsk front. This was actually a very active front. However, now we are, how do you say it? We are, I thought this would be where the Russians would focus after, winter was all about Donetsk, and I thought the spring would be about Chasiv Yar. Seems like right now it's still Donetsk's dance. However, Bakhmut still has a little bit of a tap dancing thing to show us. So, sorry, I had to get a drink of water. So, what happened in Chasov Yar in Bakhmut? The Russians are continuously, are still putting pressure on this front. The Russians are right now. I think they have a bit of positions in like the outskirts of this canal zone, this canal district. However, the Russians aren't able to continuously expand here. The Ukrainians are continuously using these high-rise buildings to their full effect. The Russians are bombing this constantly, but they keep having reinforcements, and so it's very hard for the Russians to continue trying to expand their bridge here. And the Russians are basically doing the tried and true tactic of trying to put pressure on multiple points on this kind of canal zone. The main purpose of the Russians here is, yes, take Chasov Yar, but they're trying to the first step. They're again taking a city like Chasov Yar, just like Bakhmut, is steps. You don't just take it in one step. There's multiple steps. The first step the Russians have to do is reach the canal. That way they are on equal heights. Again, the whole battle from Bakhmut to Chasov Yar was a completely uphill battle for the Russians. And so once they reach the canal, the canal is on equal height. And so they're able to fight on equal ground. But they need to reach it first. The first thing the Russians have a lot of progress on is kind of more to the south. After the capture of Ivanivska, the Russians have basically been putting a lot of focus on this kind of hill right here. And a lot of geolocated footage shows that kind of the southern part of this hill, the Russians are almost at the canal zone. They have almost reached the canal right here. And so they are trying to basically clear the Ukrainians away from this kind of hill, because once this hill is taken by the Russians, not only does it secure Ivanivska a bit better, because Ivanivska is more on the lowland, they're able to shell or attack this canal district from the south here, directly from the north. The Russians are still trying to attack these dachas to the north of this area, because capturing these dachas is critical in order to attack this from the north. However, it's back and forth. It's very hard for the Russians to secure themselves in these dachas. One thing that's been announced, however, this week was the complete capture of Bogdanovka by the Russian MOD. And, one thing that's, I have no doubt that the town itself, right, this area is under full Russian control. However, one thing that's the big question a lot of people are asking, like, what about the hills, this area right here? This is technically part of Bogdanovka. It has, like, a farmhouse, but this hill basically gives a tactical local heights to whoever holds it. And right now, it's up in the air if the Ukrainians still hold it or if the Russians have also captured this. Because if the Russians have captured this, then it's GG Bogdanovka. The Ukrainians had to retreat to Kalinova. However, if the Ukrainians hold this, then the Russians cannot utilize Bogdanovka to the fullest extent that they usually could. So they have to capture if the Russians have to basically confirm they've captured this hill right here in order to fully utilize Bogdanovka. And how do you utilize Bogdanovka? Let's say the Russians have taken that hill. If the Russians say the Russian position is something like this, right? Let's say this is how the new Russian defense line is. Then what the Russians could do from here is they could start their advance towards Kalinova. And again, they're trying to encircle Chasov Yar from sides and directly. And so, Kalinova is the last village that the Ukrainians have on this side of the Sovietsky Donbass Canal. And the capture of this village will basically be the springboard towards starting to encircle Chasov Yar from the north. So Bogdanovka, and also the capture of Bogdanovka also helps solidify to start encircling and pushing Ukrainians from the north of this canal zone. So as you can see, the Russians are, they're not attacking this directly. They're trying to secure themselves, trying to fully secure this hill right here. And there's been, they're mostly, this week they kind of started continuously focused on kind of the south of this hill. They are solidifying themselves in the north of Bogdanovka, trying to solidify themselves here so that they could, put pressure on the canal from the north. And then from here, they're going to try to attack this this extension of Chasov Yar and take it, because then this is the forward outpost towards the center of Chasov Yar. So, some progress. The big news this week was the fall of Bogdanovka. So we shall see how that work. How the Russians could, how the Russians could expand from the capture of Bogdanovka. So, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to get themselves to the Sovietsky Donbass Canal, which I think they could do by the end of spring, but the Battle of Chasov Yar has just begun. On the Seversk front, the Russians are still trying to, there's been battles towards Vimka right here, along these open fields. The Russians have made slow progress here, but something to talk about. Same old story as I told about in the last week or two. The Russians are still trying to climb up this kind of chalkboard right here. I call this the chalkboard mountain, even though it's not. Yeah, it's like a tactical height, and the Russians are trying to secure this area so that they can have a better tactical positioning. But nothing big has happened this week. The clash is still going on there. We also have on the there's been no changes on the Liman front. The Russians are trying to reach Ocheretyne. There's been no changes on the Kupiansk front. What else? The Russians are, they're putting some pressure on this axis. They've kind of entered the more southern, not the southern, but kind of expanded their position so that the Ukrainians are pushed back toward Ocheretyne. The Ukrainians were kind of trying to get to this field to try to, try to get a bit of an expansion out of Ocheretyne, but the Russians pushed them back to the village, but nothing too major. On the Zaporozhye front, the Russians and the Ukrainians are still battling in the center of Robotyne, but no changes this week. And no changes on the Kherson front. And anything else that we want to discuss this week besides the frontline changes? Nope. That's. Oh yeah, one big thing is that the U.S. House of Representatives has passed the $60 billion in aid. And so that's basically what's that's gonna in terms of that though, the $60 billion seems a lot, but if you look at the actual specifics of the bill, only about like $15 billion is earmarked towards Ukraine being able to buy weapons from the U.S. And then if they buy weapons, again, the U.S. doesn't have these in stock; they have to buy them directly from the manufacturer, and then it takes a few months for them to actually make those orders. So. This obviously it helps Ukraine. Any little bit helps, but I think they passed this because they realized the Russians were going to do some sort of summer offensive, and they realized if they didn't give anything, the Ukrainians were going to lose that battle. They thought, right now the common wisdom is that this is a stalemate, and that's true. But the Russian, at any point this could turn into an actual. We could get back to the big arrow offensive if again this is the attrition war, and if one side becomes too attritioned, we go back to maneuver warfare, and I think that's why they're trying to pass the $60 billion because they realize that if the Russian summer offensive is successful, that it could very well be that they return to them maneuver warfare, and they want to prevent that. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Give this video a like if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel if you want to continue seeing these updates to the Ukrainian war and keep you updated on this war. And comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.